Here we go, another back to basics video. Today we're going to talk all about slicing. Hello everyone, Chris here. Yes, we're doing a back to basics series to help folks get started with 3D printing. Slicing is something that is very important in this process, and today we're going to talk about that as well as how 3D printing works and how you utilize the slicer in this additive process. So if you want to see these back to basics videos, you're just getting into 3D printing, please hit subscribe and hit that bell notification so that you can see these as they come out. We do release them every week. So today we're going to talk about Prusa Slicer. There's a lot of different slicer programs out there. A lot of them are free to use, but I've been using Prusa Slicer or some version of it for many, many years. It's open source, and again, it is free. And you don't just have to use a Prusa printer with Prusa Slicer. It will support a lot of different machines, and it has profiles in there for those machines, so you don't have to create your own. But we're going to talk about the basics, how you slice a file. In the last video, we did go over Fusion and talk about CAD drawings. Now we're going to take that drawing, get it in the slicer, and I'll show you how to get it to your 3D printer so you can print it. So let's just jump right in and we'll take a look at how to install Prusa Slicer. So a little housekeeping first. For these videos, I decided to start tracking what the mouse and the keyboard does. So you're going to see the different keys that I punch in as well as the mouse clicks. You can see down here in the corner, this is the index of what the mouse click buttons mean. I'll try to walk you through them, but when you're watching this back, if the mouse click is left, you can see it's red. Center, it's blue, and then right is green. So that gives you an idea of what the mouse is doing and the buttons I'm pressing, so you can follow along better. Again, the keyboard keys will show up as well. You'll see that a little later. So for Prusa Slicer, first thing we need to do is head over to Prusa3D.com and download it. It should be on the main page. We'll just go ahead and click Prusa Slicer right here. You can also get Prusa Slicer from the Help menu up here for your specific printer. But again, remember, Prusa Slicer, you can use it on pretty much any 3D printer you wish. So we'll just download for Windows right now. It does support Mac and Linux. And you don't have to subscribe to the Prusa newsletter if you don't want to. Once the download's complete, we'll go ahead and open it up. Remember, you can go to your File Explorer in the Downloads folder by default to grab it as well, but we'll just click on it here in Chrome, and we'll start the install. We're going to go with English. You can set whatever destination you wish. This is the default one. We'll just hit Next. Most of the time, you're not going to need drivers for your printer, but you can install those if you wish. Today, we're just going to install Prusa Slicer. We'll hit Next. This is going to create your shortcuts. We'll just leave it default. We'll hit Next. We'll create a desktop icon so that we can get back to it easily. Next. And then all this is good. We'll just hit install. And we're done. We'll let it launch Prusa Slicer. Now, I have installed Prusa Slicer many times in the past, so mine might look a little bit different than a first-time user, but when you open it up for the first time, it should launch this wizard to help you get it set up. Don't be overwhelmed by any of these settings. We're going to click through most of them, but I am going to walk you through it. This will be the most simplistic install possible because I want to get you up and running fast. So we'll just hit Next. You can connect Prusa Slicer with your Prusa account, but you don't have to. So we'll just hit Next. You can also save your profiles on online accounts. You can back them up to the cloud if you're connected to Prusa Slicer. You can also pick which local source. This is a little more than the basics, so we're just going to leave the defaults and hit Next. And here's where you can select your Prusa printer. On the next tab, we can look at non-Prusa machines, but today we are going to be using the Prusa Mark III. It's a very common printer. It's also a very common 3D printer design. A lot of folks that are getting started in 3D printing will have something somewhat similar to a Prusa machine. And they are very easy to use machines for the first-time user. So again, you can get a little overwhelmed with all the options, but what I'm going to do is suggest you just hit None. Unselect all the machines that it might have already, and just choose the one that you have. Again, any option that might be ticked, we're going to hit None to clear it. We're in the Mark III series. Most 3D printers, the most common nozzle size is a 0.4, and that's what we're using today. If you know that you have a different nozzle size, we'll go into that much later, but 0.4 is going to be the most common. So we're going to select the original Mark III's, Mark III's Plus, 0.4 nozzle. And I'm just going to make sure none of the other machines are selected because I only want one. I want to make this simple for you as much as possible. So now we only have our Mark III selected. We'll hit next. We don't have any SLA machines. We'll hit next. And then these are all the other 3D printers that Prusa Slicer currently has a profile for. It will support pretty much any 3D printer, but these are specifically designed for these printer brands. If you don't have a Prusa printer, go through here and find one that you do have, like a Voron. If you tick that and hit next, it's going to give you all the printers it has a profile for in the Voron family. So if that's the way you want to go ahead and select whichever printer you might have. But I'm going to go back for now and just unselect the Voron because we're going to be focused on one printer only. That's going to save you a lot of missed clicks if you don't select the right machine when you're slicing your file. So we're good here. We'll just hit next. Other SLA machines, same thing if you have an alternate SLA. You can also define your custom profiles. That's very advanced stuff outside of this video, but we'll hit next for now. We're not going to do that. And then for filaments, I suggest you do the same thing. We're going to focus on Prusa PLA. It's very consistent. PLA is a very easy filament to use, so we're going to start there. You can always come back and run this wizard again from the configuration menu up here if you want to add more filaments or make adjustments, add more printers. But for now, I'm just going to hit none. And then I'm only going to select Prusa PLA. And the Prusa PLA profile is going to work for a lot of different filaments. It's a great place to start, and then you can always tune it later if you need to. So one filament for now. We'll hit next. There's always updates coming out for Prusa Slicer, so I highly suggest you leave these ticked so you can apply the updates as they come out. We'll hit next. Allow built-in downloader. That's so you can download things directly from the printable site, the Prusa site for STL files. We don't need to do that today. We'll just hit next. This allows you to export full path names for your models. We don't need to worry about that today. We'll hit next. You can associate all files that are 3MF, which is a container of STL files, and STL files with Prusa Slicer. Since you're getting started, you're probably only going to have one slicer, so I suggest you tick both of these. So that anything that is an STL or a 3MF file that we create, you can double click on it and it will open Prusa Slicer for you. So we're good here. We'll hit next. And I'm going to leave this in expert mode. If you choose simple mode or advanced mode, it's going to hide some settings for you. It is just a little less complicated, but I want to leave it in this mode so you're used to seeing it, even though we're not going to adjust a lot of settings right now. We're going to leave it in expert so they are there for the future. You can also change if you'd like to use inches. The default is metric. We're going to leave it in millimeters because that's how we have Fusion set up. So we'll hit finish. And here are the defaults from what we've selected in the wizard. We've got Prusa PLA and our Mark III 3D printer. You can see in the pull downs, you do have some user settings. These are things that I've created in the past. You won't have those yet, but that's how you save anything you'd like to change up about the default setting. But we're good here, Prusa PLA. This is where you select what type of filament, and then your printer. Again, we only selected the one printer in the wizard, but I do have custom configurations. That's how you save the changes if you want to make changes to the default profile. But again, we're only focused on one printer right now. And then print settings, most of the time as you're getting started, you can leave these default. So you have different options of the type of print settings that you would like. These are a mix of settings to try to get you different qualities and speeds from your printer. Getting started, I suggest you select a 0.2 layer height with the speed profile. This is a pretty good mix of quality and speed. These profile settings suggest that lower layer heights are going to get you better quality, a better looking part, as well as slower speeds will get you a better looking, better quality part. You'll see more of that, but again, we're just trying to get started. So we're going to select the 0.2 layer height speed profile. The layer height is very important in 3D printing. I'll go over it just a little bit. But doing different layer heights could require a different nozzle. If you go over that 0.4 nozzle size, you can imagine you're going to have a larger nozzle to support those layers. That's more of an advanced topic. This is going to be great to get set up for now. So just to get set up in Prusa Slicer and print something, you don't have to do anything else. But now we need to get our CAD model over to Prusa Slicer so we can slice it. So let's go back to Fusion for a second. We're going to redo what we did in the previous video. All we did was make a 50mm cylinder. So I'm going to go over it with you one more time. And remember, you can follow the clicks. So I'm going to go up here after loading Fusion. We know that we're in millimeters. That's what we want. I'm going to turn the origin on so I can see it. And keep in mind, this is the view of the part that we're making. We're kind of looking at it from the top corner here. In 3D printing, we are building from the bottom up. It's additive, one layer at a time. So we like to draw on the plane that gets us in that orientation. So it directly relates to what we're viewing up here on the cube. But I'm going to grab a sketch over here with this icon, Create Sketch. We'll just click it. We'll click on the plane we'd like to create our sketch. I'm going to create it on this one down here because we're going to be working from the bottom up. That's going to switch the cube orientation. You can see we're looking at it from the top now. I'm going to go back to the Create panel here and grab a circle. Just left click, and I'm going to land it in the center of our build plane because it's easier to work from the center out so you can keep track of where you are. So I'm just going to left click the center here where I want to start placing it. And then I can drag it out to as big as I like. You can also punch in the keys. You'll see the keys that I hit on the bottom. I'm just going to punch in 50 to make it 50, and I'm going to hit enter. So now we have a 50mm circle, and we come over here to finish our sketch. We're done drawing for now. Now it flips us back to that corner view. Now to make it a 3D object, again, we're just going over the same things. We're going to extrude it. Now you can do that from the Create menu up here. Just go to Extrude. But I would suggest you get comfortable with the hotkeys. Extrude is going to be one of the most common ones, and it's just the E key. So we'll click out of that. I'm going to click inside the circle. It's going to highlight it blue, and then I'm going to hit my E key. For Extrude, that puts me in Extrude mode. You can change these up. You don't need to for now, but just select, left click and hold that arrow. Bring it up to as tall as you'd like it to be. Let go. We're at 50mm, just like in the last video. We'll hit enter. Now we have a 3D object. How do you get that object over to your slicer? So in Fusion, to do that, we're going to go up here to Utilities. And we're going to select Make. And then we're going to click on the part that we'd like to print, our cylinder here. And again, to try to keep things simple, over here, Preparation Type, I'm going to switch Manufacturing over to Export, because we're going to export it as a file and pull it into our slicer. You can select which format you would like. 3MF would work just fine, but I want to focus on STL files for now. So I'm going to format STL binary. And once you have your object selected, you can see we've got one selected here. We're ready to go to export as STL, and we'll just hit OK. Now you can save this file, whatever you'd like to call it, wherever you want to on your computer. So I'm just going to save it in my Downloads folder, and we'll just call it 50mm cylinder. Once you've named it what you want, you can go ahead and hit Save. Now we've saved an STL file of this drawing onto our computer. So now let's go back to Prusa Slicer. We're going to add that cylinder to our print bed. So up here, we'll click Add, and then we'll find that file we created. Mine defaulted to the download directory where we saved it in Fusion. Again, you can select wherever you want, but there's our 50mm cylinder. We'll hit Open, and you can see it brought it in on its side. And I'm showing it like this on purpose so that I can show you how to correct something, because it's not always going to come into the slicer how you want it to. We'll get more into how to control that in Fusion in later videos, but for now, let's just go with how to fix it in the slicer. There's lots of different features in the slicer. It's very powerful, but again, we're just going over the basics. So we have our file in Prusa Slicer, but let's talk just a little bit about how 3D printing works. We'll just go ahead and slice this file. When you slice a file, It's putting together all that G-code to be able to create your part line by line, like your 3D printer does. And just remember how a 3D printer does its work. We are taking the nozzle, we are extruding hot filament layer by layer to build up our model. But you can't go against gravity most of the time. Whatever you are printing is going to have something to be printed on, the bed or some sort of support structure. So it's impossible to print things in mid-air. We have to have it supported in some fashion. And in Prusa Slicer, I'm going to try to make this obvious. We have our cylinder set on the side here. This bar, if you left click and hold and drag down, you can go through every layer of the part. So we'll just start at the beginning. Because that cylinder is round, just a very small portion of it is setting on the bed. The sides of it are now suspended in air. The printer could probably handle this just fine, but it's going to be a bit messy as it builds it up because this isn't supported. On the 3D print, depending on how you do your print settings, but by default, the print settings we use with that 0.2 profile, we just have 2 outer layers and then we have 15% infill, so filler. There's going to be a lot of air inside this part. But you don't need a lot of plastic inside for most things that you're going to 3D print. But you can just build up through this to see how it's actually going to be printed layer by layer. So this is fine, it would work, but that's not optimal. So we'll go back. We're going to go to the editor view. That's how you change these down here. We have the preview, what we're in now, which it automatically goes to it after you slice it. And then we'll go back to the 3D editor view. Also notice that Prusa Slicer is giving you a warning talking about stability issues because you're trying to print stuff that's in mid-air. So let's go back to the editor. One thing you're going to want to use right out of the gate is how to set an object on a surface. So we'll come over here to the Place on Face tool. We'll click that. It's going to show you all the faces of the object you've loaded that you can lay this flat on. And with our cylinder, it doesn't really matter, but it's going to print a whole lot better if we lay it on its end. So we'll just click on this face. That rotates it, and now it makes it flat on the print bed. So we'll just unclick our Place on Face tool here, and then we'll slice again. We're back to the preview mode. We'll go down through the layers one more time. But now that first layer is completely on the bed. There's nowhere where we're printing in mid-air. Everything is supported. So if you would like to print this object, now that you've put it on the bed correctly, you've got your print settings, everything's ready to go, you can just hit Export G-code. But that's just going to create a G-code file that you load on your printer. We have to get it over to our printer first. Most 3D printers are going to have one type of media that you can use to get your files over to your printer to print from. The most common are SD cards, micro SD cards, and USB drives. Most computers that you're working off of are going to have a USB drive. Not all will have a card slot. So the USB drive is the most convenient to use when you're using a PC. But if you're using an SD card, you can often get these very affordable converters that will just go in your USB drive. You can put your SD card in here, plug that into the computer, and put your files on it. So that's what we need to do to get our files over to our 3D printer. I will leave a link to one of these in the description below if you want to check it out. They're very affordable. And our Prusa Mark III does read all of its information from a full-size SD card, so we'll pull that out of the screen. It is important to remember that you are reading directly from these cards. There's no type of memory in here that is storing these files, not on the Mark III. Other machines might have that, but again, a little bit outside of the basics. So it has to remain in the printer the whole time while it's printing. It's reading this off the card directly, line by line. But back to Prusa Slicer. Now that we have our SD card, I'm just going to plug it into my computer. And that will bring up a little icon down here. You just saw it appear. That will allow you to export it directly to that SD card that it found on the computer. So we'll just hit this icon. Since I only had one mounted on this machine, it took me directly to that SD card. You can see all of the STL files I have on here already. And we're just going to save our cylinder on the SD card. Now we're ready to take that SD card over to the printer, and we can start printing. It is always a good idea to eject SD cards or USB drives just to keep them safe, to make sure they're consistent before you pull them out of the machine. Prusa Slicer does have an option down here to eject it. So we'll just hit eject, and we're good to remove it. You can see the icon went away down here. That means the computer doesn't know about it any longer. Now we can take it out and take it to the printer. Then from there, we've got our file on our SD card. On the Prusa machine, we're just going to plug it in. By default, it automatically starts reading the files and gives you a list, and it should have the newest file on top. You can sort that in the menu however you want to, but that is the default setting. You can see that very first one there is our 50mm cylinder, the file we just sent over. You can click on that, and then it will start printing. We're not ready to do that quite yet, but that's the basic process. And remember, this is just the basics here. There are a lot of great ways to get around using SD cards and drives like this nowadays. With networking, you can hook these printers up so you can send the files to them directly. I'm just trying to show you the basics, how all of this works. How do you get from that software over to the hardware? And I thought this was the best way to step through it. So we're not going to start printing in this video, but I do want to talk just a little bit more about Prusa Slicer and creating 3D printed models. So at this point, you could fire up your 3D printed cylinder here, you could print them out, have a great time, but it's really not all that exciting. But we're going to build on top of this, literally. We're going to go into Fusion, and we're going to talk about support structures. So back to Fusion. Most 3D printers nowadays can easily do a 45-degree overhang. That means as it builds it up layer by layer, it can stack it in such a way that it can tolerate that overhang. You want to keep in mind when you're designing your parts for 3D printing, what you're doing here. It is additive manufacturing. We're building from the ground up. So for example, we'll continue working in Fusion here. Let's go back to Solid, and let's create a sketch on top of our cylinder. So we'll hit Sketch again, and I'm just going to click on the top of the cylinder. Now you are drawing on top of that body. You can see your bodies by opening this window up here. Body 1, we only have one, but that's the cylinder. We're drawing on top of it. Let's create a circle that's a little larger than our cylinder. So we just hit the circle, we'll click in the center of this body, and let's make it 70mm. I'll just type in 70 and hit enter. And if we come over here to our block to move around so that we can look at what we've just done, I'm going to move this over a bit. You can see that I have a circle on top of my cylinder. So I'm just going to finish this sketch. And then I'm going to hit the E key again and extrude our new circle. Now it's going to divide it up since you're drawing on top of this cylinder. It's going to divide it up so there's the body and our new circle. If we just clicked in the circle and started dragging that up, it's not going to include the cylinder. It's going to create kind of a ring around it because we're just extruding that piece. So if you come over here and cancel what we just selected, we'll just hit this X. We're going to select both of these. So we'll select the cylinder. It does default to where you dragged it out previously, trying to keep track of your drawings for you. I'm just going to set it back to 0 for now. You can change those up to previous measurements with these, or you can always fill it in over here, or do it just live by hitting in 0 and hitting enter. Many different ways to achieve the same thing. But I have the cylinder selected, and I'm also going to select the outer ring. So this time when we pull up, let's just pull up 15. That includes everything. And it's going to join it together. So when we hit OK, that's going to create one body with our cylinder and our new part on top of it. So let's just hit OK. So now this is what our new part looks like. Remember, we're moving around with this block up here. But we have an overhang. A pretty drastic one. And if we tried to print this from the bottom up, this would be printing in mid-air, this overhang. It might be able to do it, but it's going to be a mess. So you have to take into account how you're designing the part for 3D printing. This one's really easy because we could just flip it upside down. We could print it from the top down in our slicer, and it would work just fine. But as you get into more complicated parts, you can't always do that. We can try our best to design the parts for 3D printing, but it's not always going to work for us. So with this, you have a couple of different things you could do. I recommend always fixing it in CAD before you try to get around it with features in the slicer. So remember, I told you, you can handle a 45-degree angle in 3D printing pretty much on any machine. So if for some reason I had to print it exactly like this, first thing I would try is to be able to tolerate some sort of chamfer underneath this part that would help support it. And that's a very easy thing to add. So I'm going to come up here to Modify. I'm going to select Chamfer. And I want an angle to support this overhang. So I'm going to click inside on this edge. With chamfer and fillet, you're always going to select an edge. So we'll select it, and then you can pull that edge out and it will create a chamfer. So let's just pull it out so you can see. But see how it's creating kind of a cone around our object. You can't go outside of an object with a chamfer. You can't go outside here because it would be larger than what we're trying to work with. But it created a 45-degree angle that the printer can handle no problem. So we'll hit OK. Now we no longer have that scenario where you'd be printing in mid-air. It will print the cylinder and then it will step out layer by layer, do the chamfer, and then create our part. So that's just one of many ways to fix it so you're not printing in mid-air. So for this example, I am going to save this one. I'm just going to go back to Utilities and hit Make, select the object, and we will save it as an STL file. So let's just call this one Part 2. And to show you one of my favorite features in any program, basically, the undo. If you hit Control-Z, that will do an undo. You also have the undo up here. We'll go into the history of the part much later. That's very handy when you're working in Fusion. But since I just made this change for the chamfer, I'm just going to hit undo. That will get rid of it. And I'm going to export this one as well. Let's just make this one. And we'll call it Part 1. And I'm just doing this so I can show you how Slicer is going to handle different scenarios. So now, back to Slicer. We don't want to work with our cylinder anymore. We have a new part that we'd like to mess with. So I'm just going to hit the trash can button up here at the top. That'll get rid of everything that's on the plate. You can also select individual items and hit the delete key to get rid of different items, but you'll see them start stacking up out here. We'll build all of that. I'll show you how to do it as we go. But for one part, I'm just going to bring in Part 1. We're going to play like we have to print it from the bottom up. So we'll select that. Place on face. We'll place it on the face. So now we have this overhang. If you were to slice it, it's going to tell you you have stability issues because you're going to be printing in mid-air. In Prusa Slicer, you can see it calls out the different features of the part. Overhang perimeters are going to be this blue color. That's trying to tell you you have an overhang that isn't supported. You can't print in mid-air. One thing you can do is add supports. So let's go back to the editor window. I have an overhang that needs to be supported. You can come up here in the easiest form of supports. Just hit supports, open up the pull down. And for today, we're just going to select support on build plate only. So it won't have supports all over it. It's just supporting the objects that are parallel to the build plate that need support. It makes the decisions on what needs support. Now, if you have that selected, we'll hit slice. You can see that it's created a support structure all around that overhang to support it when it's printing it. You would no longer be printing in mid-air, you'd be printing on this support material. This takes a lot more material, and you want to stay away from supports if you can, because supports can be pretty difficult to remove. They've come a long way, but you still don't want to have to use them unless you have to. If you slide down through with our selector here to show what is being printed. That bright green there is all support. It's not as solid as the part material would be. You can see it's just really thin lines, but it still takes filament, and it's just a waste object. Again, you don't want to have to use supports unless you have to. So design your parts to not use supports. Design them to be used for 3D printing, like we did with the chamfer. So let's go to that. Let's go back to our editor. I'm going to can this one, and we'll bring in part 2. Here's part 2, the one with the chamfer on it. Again, we're going to play like we have to print it from the bottom up. Place on face. And this one has a 45-degree angle. Your printer can handle that. So let's just slice it. After we turn off support structures. I forgot that part. Once you turn it on, if you don't reset your Prusa slicer, it's going to leave it on. So let's turn it back off. We'll just set it back to none. And let's slice now. Now we have the part. We don't have any warning down here saying that things aren't supported, because it's going to be able to handle this part no problem. If you trace back down, let's go back down to the cylinder, and we'll zoom in really close. So if you left click out on the plate and hold it and then move your mouse around, that lets you move around the object. If you right click and hold, that lets you move the whole plate if you're trying to get a good look at some sort of part. And then if you use your scroll wheel, that lets you zoom in and out. This works both in the editor and in the preview. So I want to zoom in, kind of angle it so that I can show you what we're dealing with here. You can see every layer line that it's going to put down. And that's what this bar is telling you. It starts at 0.2, your first layer. Remember, we set to a 0.2 layer height up here in our printer settings, but it shows you every 200 micron, 0.2, as it builds it up. But look what happens when we get to that chamfer. You can see, if you get in really close, it's able to start stacking that chamfer a little bit to the side of that layer. So we start working our way up, it stacks it out. Let me try to get you in from the side. So you can see the side of the part right here. It builds it up and allows it to stack it out just slightly as it builds that chamfer, so it's able to support itself. You're not printing in midair, you're just printing a little bit further out in that same layer. And then when it's done, it goes back to the rest of the cylinder just fine. It's supporting itself. And we could do the same thing. We could just export the G code or send it over to our SD card, put it on our printer, no problem at all. And as I said before, Prusa Slicer is very powerful. There's lots of different things you can do, different tricks that will get you through your 3D printing journey much faster. We're just touching the basics here, but I did show you that the chamfer keeps you from having supports, but remember, this object is very simple. If we can this one and bring back in part 1, you just have to know how to look at the part. We placed it on the face because I wanted to show you how supports work. But with this part, there's a direct path to print it. You just print it upside down. So we'll place on face, we'll print it from here, overhang's gone, no issues at all. This is just the basics. You'll see more of the advanced stuff as we move through. So there you go. We're at the very beginning of slicing a part to be able to run it on your 3D printer. But hopefully this will help you get it installed, how you use the very basic settings, and give you an idea of what we're getting ready to do here. It's going to create that part layer by layer, and to create a part like that, you need to keep 3D printing in mind, or find another way using the software to be able to tolerate any overhangs or inconsistencies with whatever you might create. We're going to go into all that in great detail in future videos, but next week we're going to talk about getting that part set up to actually print it on your printer, and all the little tricks that you need to be able to have a successful print every time. So hopefully you found this helpful. That's it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.